Hello and welcome to the Groupthink Podcast. Joining us on the show today is a guest I'm very excited to talk with. Paul VanderKlay is a Calvinist pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. He's running what I feel is one of the most interesting Christian discussion channels on YouTube with well over 13,000 subscribers, and he's had the opportunity to talk with many of the most interesting voices on YouTube. I owe my previous guest, Esther O'Reilly, some credit for sending me his way. How's it going today?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And yourself?
I'm doing all right, considering I just managed to beat Snowpocalypse, the first Snowpocalypse of the year in Chicago on my way back home from work, so...
Well, I can assure you we are getting no snow in Sacramento.
I have a friend who lives out in Fresno, and she's always telling me that people in, like, the Central California tend to get wonky weather, so I don't know what Sacramento can be like, but...
Well, winters are in the 50s, high of in the 50s. We'll get into the 30s at night. We'll get a dozen freezes, but summers are very, very hot. So,
lucky you. I mean, when Chicago people are used to extremes, but but when things get really extreme, that's when becomes like a full moon. You start seeing the really squirrely stuff come out, like when we had when all the Jesse Smollett stuff was happening. That was during when the polar vortex where we had like sub 30 degree temperatures. So when things get really cold, people in Chicago get really weird. So.
Well, I lived 10 years of my life in Grand Rapids, so I do know what the Midwest is like. Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Oh, nice. So kind of to start out with, you're a successful church pastor with a family and a full life outside of YouTube. Generally speaking, the YouTube game is kind of one of those, like, nihilist millennial celebrity atheist games. I'm sure you've seen, like, those horrifying statistics that, like, of millennials that say that they're more of them want to be like YouTubers than astronauts. How did you kind of get caught up in this madhouse?
More of them want to be YouTubers than astronauts. I hadn't heard that. Well, how did I get caught up on that? Well, so a number of years ago, I realized that, some people might miss church and want to hear the sermons. So I started posting some of the sermons on YouTube. And then a member of my church he came to me one day and said, "Pastor, you and me should do a TV show." And I thought, well, I don't know if that's going to happen. So I said, I'll tell you what, Fred, let's have the Freddie and Paul show, and I'll just throw it up on YouTube. And so I put it up on YouTube so that he could watch it and he could share it with some of his friends, and it would just be a fun little thing to do. And then I had blogged for a number of years, and after one of the denominational synods, I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a synod post-game show. So I made a YouTube synod post-game show where I talked about the issues at that synod. And I had thought about doing some book writing, but I realized as a pastor that a lot of the people that I minister to don't read books. And any book that I would write, well, they might buy it because I'm their pastor, but they probably wouldn't read it. And I thought, I bet you a lot of people are just watching videos. And so then the Jordan Peterson phenomena hit, and I began to notice that people were... I had previously seen people deconverting from Christianity or people going to New Age ideas and some of these things, and I'd seen that pretty much as a one-way street. And Jordan Peterson on YouTube was making a lot of people interested in Christianity and church and the Bible, and I recognized that this had a lot to do with YouTube too. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make a couple videos, see what happens. And that I made a couple videos, and whereas I had maybe 10 or 12 subscribers to my channel that had, sermons and the Freddie and Paul show, pretty quickly I had quite a few more subscribers and people were contacting me. So I've continued to use YouTube sort of in the same way. Well, one aspect of it use it the same way that I was blogging, which was a way to just think out loud, put some thoughts down, process ideas, and then others wanted to have conversations with me, so I started posting those conversations, and then people said, well, you should talk to such and such a person. Authors, once my channel got to a certain size, authors decided that, oh, maybe I can talk to Paul and get a little publicity for my book, which happens sometimes. And so that the channels just continue to develop in that way.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, what's that experience been like ministering to young people on the internet? Like, are you seeing a positive effect from it?
Well, effect in which way?
Well, it compares to how you're dealing with in real life, because obviously you're dealing with two very different mediums, preaching to people in person versus preaching to people on the internet.
I think people actually open up more quickly on the internet than they do in real life. In terms of a pastoral relationship, I think in some ways people are more ready to spill their guts to a world full of strangers than to risk disclosure even with a pastor that they've known for a while in the context of real life relationships. So I think YouTube has a tremendous potential for pastoral ministry.
That's true. I mean, I can attest to the internet being a place that's way easier to throw things into the void being. I do writing for a Christian website called Geeks Under Grace, and I've been talking a lot in my articles lately about the experience of being a single 25-year-old man who's trying to deal with his approach to life in a godly way. And I wrote an essay about idolizing relationships and feeling like you're left out around Valentine's Day. And I sent it to a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, and they all wrote back to me and being like, "This is really personal." I'm like, and I'm just sitting here like, I didn't even think about that was writing it. I was just thinking like this is just me talking to the paper. It's just me talking to the people on this website who I don't know personally, thinking like, oh, I'm sure if I share all these like talk about my own feelings, it's not a big deal. And then you send it to people who actually know you, and they're like, wow, I never thought about that you had these thoughts, Tyler. And I'm like, well, yeah. So the internet can be, for good and ill, the internet can be an amazing place for people to show their better and worse selves in an honest way.
Yes, it can.
So in that regard, like, what do you think about the state of the church then in regards to how the internet's affecting things? Because obviously you've talked in your videos about how you think that a lot of the church, and especially in the church in America, is not in a good place. But I see a lot of like little corners of the internet where the church is blossoming in strange ways. Do you think that's just an internet phenomenon where it's just these tiny little spots, or do you think there's something going on the bleeding edge of culture right now?
For better and worse, the internet is going to be a part of our lives going forward, and it dramatically changes the way we relate to one another, the way we group up, and very much the way we think, probably in terms of deep processes that we are not fully conscious of. I think just as the printing press around the time of the Protestant Reformation, I think the internet is going to radically change people's assumptions about God, about living. I think it's going to dramatically change how we gather as church. And some of these changes will be beneficial, and some of these changes will be full of loss. And at this point, I don't think we can sit back and know it, and especially not manage it. It's going to happen.
Well, there you go. I mean, I'm coming at this from a place where I followed the internet culture, if you, whatever you call it, for a while. I mean, having grown up with it as someone in my age group, and I can tell you, before the last few years, it was a much different place tonally than it has been in the past few. Where I've never seen religious content on the internet like I have in the past few years, where there's people actually debating ideas in the way you and Jordan Peterson are. Like, go back a decade ago, it was nothing but atheist and anti-theist channels on YouTube, basically just getting into fights with creationists and declaring themselves the victors. I mean, they got to a point around like 2015 where all of the major like atheist channels are like, we've won the culture war, religion is on the run, all the statistics are going in our way, and then like 2 years later Jordan Peterson just skyrockets. So the defeat has been snatched from the jaws of victor, or however that saying goes in that case. So I'm sitting here like, is something happening where this could be where there's a chance to expand? Is this just going to become like a situation where like small pockets of the internet are going to start becoming like super Christian? I mean, obviously this doesn't necessarily convert into the mainstream culture necessarily, but I mean, like you said, obviously the internet's going to change a lot of this. Like being out in the real world that I'm evidently not as a connection to as you would probably be. What do you think the difference is there?
Well, if you think about the printing press, what the printing press did was afford rapid reproduction of books. But we had books before. The printing press afforded rapid creation of pamphlets, but we had pamphlets before. The internet did not only give everyone or almost everyone the power of the printing press, but not just publication and reproduction of text, but images, voice, and even controlling let's say there's a machine that's somehow going to hook into me or drive senses or in some way or not, that can be controlled over the internet. The potential for the internet in terms of reshaping what we understand a human being to be is more than we can think about right now. That is going to change us, and especially human community, deeply. And the social, we talk about social media. Well, social media is just the continued evolution of certain internet tools. And we're only, I am old enough to remember the world before the internet. The internet came online and suddenly, wow, there's porn. Wow, there's TV preachers. Wow, there's World of Warcraft. And I mean, we've only begun to tinker with virtual reality, augmented reality, and then, a neural network where the way this is going to change all of our conversations, even, for example, the rise of simulation theory with respect to what we think about God. If you watch something like, let's say, The Good Place, and watch how Michael and Janet can reshape the world in which these four dead human beings are, we wouldn't say living, but are experiencing, that those images get into our minds and impact the possibilities of what we imagine, what theology has always said God is. So, we're just at the beginning of the kinds of changes that we can't even anticipate, which will continue to change us and may radically alter what we call a human being in human society from here on out. Or, who knows what is going to happen. So that's what we're looking at. And so the little changes we've seen so far, I don't think we've seen anything yet.
You sound very optimistic about it.
I'm a Calvinist. The Calvinism is a strange brand of optimism and pessimism. Optimism because God is in charge. Pessimism about what we can do. So, No, I think it's going to be a really bumpy ride. And I think some of the things that we've seen just in the last 4 or 5 years, just like you said, who would have expected the rise of Jordan Peterson? That radically changed things. Be prepared for big swings.
Yeah, I remember saying a few years ago that I've given up any ability to predict the future because I don't like lying to people. But I mean, it would be nice to have a sense like the Scott Adams idea that what's the purpose of an ideology if it doesn't help you predict the future? Like, it would be nice if we had something that could do that. But if anyone could figure that out, they would have been a rich man much longer ago than any of us are. So
Yeah.
but I mean, obviously, that I don't like the idea of society just kind of atomizing in the way that the internet has made very, very easily. I mean, I growing up in the culture in my generation, I see way too much of that, where you see so many people that they grew up in the post-religious era where they just don't have anything going for them. They don't have any ideology. They don't have any sense of themselves or what they're capable of. So they just go on the internet and they just find ways to satiate themselves. And
Yep.
there's too many people that I think that's part of why someone like Jordan Peterson has an opportunity, and why people like you and why a lot of religious resurgence is kind of happening in corners, because there is a lot of nihilism and atomization going on right now.
Yeah, yeah, there is. And, John Vervaeke, another scholar whose work I've been tracking, he frames it as a meaning crisis. What happens when you have a level of affluence and technology so that there recently was a graph that went out that said basically since 97, the rise of video games, young people have been doing less drugs, smoking less, drinking less, having less sex because of video games. Someone might have heard, well, that's a wonderful thing. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. The question is, what does that say about us? And so you obviously had a lot of people who were sort of wasting their lives, and Jordan Peterson kind of came along and gave them a jolt, and they started cleaning their rooms and going to meetups and deciding to marry their girlfriends instead of just stringing her along until that something better came along, so on and so forth. So yeah.
Well, there you go. I mean, I did want to see if I could get you to kind of go down the rabbit hole of apologia a little bit, because me being me, I come from this generation, so I'm definitely one of the people that has had experienced a lot of growing up in a very materialist culture, growing up in a very atomized culture, and but I did grow up religious. So I had all this. I have the context for the stories and everything, and as I'm growing up, I got to a point where I just said, well, if I'm going to believe any of this stuff, I actually have to take it seriously and try. So just in the last year, I've been baptized finally. I've been growing closer to joining a church, although that might have to change because I'm moving soon. So I've finally been making the commitments religiously that I've needed to, but the more I grow into my religious beliefs, the more I realize that I don't actually know in my religious beliefs. So
Yeah.
I'm definitely I'm reading a lot more different religious sides, from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism to Calvinism. I'm friends with Emily Urban, who's a Calvinist, does Calvinist ministry up in Wisconsin. And on the opposite side of that, I'm also reading atheists and skeptics just so I have their arguments and I have an understanding of what they are. I'm reading Michael Shermer's book, The Believing Brain, right now, and that offers some interesting arguments, but obviously that's not where I am right now. So I'm curious as to what drew you to Calvinism, and what is the basis for what drew you into your faith?
Okay. Well, I would have to say, born to parents in the Christian Reformed Church. My father was a Christian Reformed minister. My grandfather was a Christian Reformed minister. So my particular brand of Calvinism that I learned in the Christian Reformed Church is what brought me there. I've I felt very at home in my tradition. I've never felt the need to leave it. But at the same time, my father ministered in a very unusual context for the Christian Reformed Church. Most Christian Reformed churches were in areas of Dutch immigration in the United States and Canada. My father was called to convert sort of a gospel benevolence mission in Paterson, New Jersey, into a local congregation. And so I grew up with quite a blend of the Christian Reformed tradition that my father had inherited, African American traditions that were expressed by the majority of the people in the church. Went on to get a degree in history from Calvin College, and then finally a theological degree from Calvin Seminary. And then I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic for a number of years. And then after that, taking the call to pastor this church in Sacramento, California. So I'm a bit of a mongrel that I've had a lot of different experiences from different traditions. I don't know if I'm barking up the right tree. Feel free to jump in and direct and clarify in terms of where you'd like me to take this and what you'd like to learn.
That's interesting, because part of me is just debating as to where I should take myself intellectually in my faith. At the moment, my religious, I guess my personal faith, it wasn't founded necessarily on the not necessarily the ideological side, because I'll watch videos from someone like Bishop Barron, and he'll talk about when he was 16 years old, he read Aquinas' argument from Desire and suddenly had a revelation. And I'm like, I never had like that moment where the classical theistic arguments clicked in my head, but from a Desire's perspective, it came from me watching people around me who are religious living lives that were much more foundationally sturdy than the ones I was seeing elsewhere. Because every single Christian I knew who went to Bible college got married by their senior year and is currently on their way to kids. And every single guy I know who is just a normal dude who went to high school with is currently living in his mom's basement. So I saw something within the religious tradition that made me like, okay, there's something functional here that I'm not seeing everywhere else. And so I kind of followed it, and I guess I kind of fell into the Jordan Peterson pragmatism school a little too much, and I know that's fraught philosophically to the point where it doesn't necessarily lead one to religious foundations, which I know I kind of need to grow more into. So as I'm kind of going back and exploring the arguments, I am obviously reading through C.S. Lewis, and I find a lot of appeal in his argument from Desire, as he mentions in Mere Christianity, which is... the quote's missing me at the moment, but something like, if you have a need in your life, if there's a need in human life, it corresponds to something that exists in the world. So if there's a mass existential need for a god, that would suggest there's a god. And that's kind of been the opening foundations for my faith. But as I'm growing into it, I'm struggling to figure out where I need to channel that into, because I've yet to meet a Christian denomination that doesn't think they're right. So I'll talk to my Calvinist friends, and they're like, yeah, you should join the Calvinists. And I'll talk to my Catholic friends, and they're like, yeah, you should join the Catholics. And I'm like, well, what do you think is a good way to direct a person's intellectual life from a Christian standpoint in terms of how they're making decisions?
Well, I think you can derive some wisdom from the story that you told me already. I don't think we are anywhere as rational or linear as we imagine ourselves to be. And I think some of what you observed, that, here are these people within religious communities who seem to be figuring out how to live life in a better way They're finding an ability to create stable. We'll use Jordan Peterson-esque language, stable pair bonds at an earlier age. They're finding a way to commit to each other, to begin, joining this dance of adulthood earlier. Maybe there's something right and true about that. That's not a bad way to begin figuring out who you want to be with, because the truth is, who you decide you want to be with will likely shape a lot of these other perspectives that finally boil down into these articulated beliefs that you're thinking through. So, and I don't want to, different individuals work differently on this score, but the fact that you basically came to some conclusions on the basis of sort of a crowd-sorted wisdom that you observed is probably indication that you will continue to use a process like this. Now, what you're trying to do is up your resolution on what might appear to be a menu of Christian traditions. Now, it's also the case that you're going to look at Orthodox and Catholics and Calvinists and Arminian Baptists and Anglicans that sort of try to span all kinds of things. You're going to look at these people, and there'll be definitely some subtle, nuanced differences between their traditions and, to a degree, their worship practices. But in all likelihood, they'll likely be living lives that are quite similar, and in fact, perhaps not all that dissimilar to other groups of people who have very little Christian belief. So really, I think a lot, I often go back to the work of Jonathan Haidt, who has written a number of interesting things, but he has this image of the rider and the elephant. In many ways, you sit astride an elephant looking at the menu of Christian denominations, wondering which one is right for me, which theological package is right for me. But that elephant beneath you will likely be the one making the decisions. And so probably one of the best things you can do is pick a tribe and start to commune with that tribe and see where it goes. And you will learn about yourself. If at this point you don't have a girlfriend or a wife, these kinds of things will come along down the line, and these things will greatly shape you. So even though I think it's worthwhile looking at all of the options, the conscious experience of cognitive choice will likely not be as big a determiner as a lot of the social, communal, practical things that shape how you actually spend your time and money. Another thing that struck me when you were talking about your story is that your generation is being catechized by the internet. That's a strange thing.
Yeah.
And so, I first caught wind of this when I was pastoring here for a few years, and I got a phone call out of the blue, someone calling me and say, "Are you a Calvinist pastor?" And first of all, most of the people who call the church line don't have any idea what a Calvinist is. If they ask, "What kind of a church are you?" I have to ask them 20 questions to figure out how I can answer that question. But this person called me and said, "Are you a Calvinist minister?" I said, "Yes." Says, "I want you to mentor me." I said, "Oh, really? Well, tell me a little bit about yourself." He grew up in a Mennonite Brethren congregation, and via chat rooms on the internet 15 years ago, because that was sort of the state of the tools, he decided he was going to be a Calvinist. And so he developed some ideas that he was a Calvinist. And we've met on and off over the last 15 years. He's never joined my church, partly because he didn't want his mentor relationship monkeying around with a pastor relationship. And he's been to all sorts of churches ever since, very few of them terribly Calvinistic. So, I think if you're if you're looking to shape your future, I would look at Christian traditions that seem to be similar to the reason you got into this in the first place. Christian traditions that seem to be pushing towards the kinds of outcomes that you find yourself attracted to, and then continue the journey and the process. And along the way, I would expect there will be readjustments.
Well, there you go. I mean, philosophically, I guess I was raised kind of halfway between Armenian baptism and Methodist, just because of how my family is always kind of split up. I mean, that's you're gonna find a lot of that among German farmers in Chicago. So,
Yes, you will.
lots of Lutherans, lots of Baptists, but I mean, part of that's also made me quite pluralistic in a sense, at least in terms of Christian traditions, because I'm surrounded by so many different kinds of Christians, and I'm surrounded by so many different denominations. And like one of my best friends in high school was Mormon, and she took me. I mean, I flew out to Salt Lake City a couple years ago, and she gave me a tour of the Mormon Holy Land, and that was
Yeah.
a utterly fascinating experience, but it gave me such insane spiritual whiplash getting experiencing all the glories and wonders of it, and then they take you into the hall and explain what it all means, and like, oh, oops, that was
Yeah, wow. You believe what?
yeah, that made me question my faith for a couple of weeks, but just like, oh, that's what that emotion can come from that. Oops, but I mean, it's gotten me to a point where I kind of have the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity is kind of on my heart, where it's I want to get to the core of it, but like I said, every single religious denomination I meet, they think they've got to the core of it. So I'm kind of at a place now where I'm just floating around in non-denominational churches, exploring just a basic understanding of the faith at its core, and also kind of hating contemporary Christian music. So I'm probably going to very rapidly start delving into one of the denominations more seriously, because I am, as much as I respect the people at my church, it's very much kind of the Babylon Bee style music rehearsal, where it's the hipster singing Christian songs I've never heard of before. So
Yeah. It's sort of like if you have never ridden a bike, looking at all the YouTubes and internet sites where, or there's this style of bike riding, there's that style of bike riding, there's this style of bike. You got to get on the bike. And that's, I think, another issue that we have going with the disruption that the internet has brought, that we are increasingly living our lives at a distance from ourselves and especially each other. And in many ways, you just got to get into life. And what that means in Christianity is, first, try to find a church you don't hate. And once you find one that you seem called to, not just one that fits you, but one where you can serve, because again, it's having a relationship with a church, and being a member of a church means that you are a part of the ministry of that church. So finding a church where God can use you, and then really finding a place to grow.
it's been interesting. I mean, so far most of my ministry I've done has been online. I mean, obviously Geeks Under Grace is not the largest pedestal to work off of, but it's been immensely good being able to talk to other Christians and to have that kind of chance to kind of explore your thoughts in a public sort of setting. But yeah, obviously it comes down to just kind of practicing on the ground and meeting people where they are, and I've gotten that from the church I'm at now. I think it used to be a Baptist church at one point. There's a lot of churches in my area that used to be Baptist, and then just became like non-denominational, generic Christian churches that play with the hipster music and they serve coffee, and it's one that kind of thing. I don't know why that's. Well, I know that's why that's so common. It's because it's popular, but
I would sometimes, if I have the opportunity to visit a random church on Sunday, I usually go in and try to figure out within the first 2 minutes what tradition did they come out of. And almost every church will have pretty significant tells. Look at where they're buying their materials. I mean, evangelicalism has continued to sort of mix that, but if you understand the sense of these different traditions, you can suss it out.
Well, there you go. I mean, I had a point I was going to say, and I lost my train of thought there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have interrupted you.
No, it's fine. I'm curious, as someone who's been at this for a long time, what is it like? How do you know when you're on the right road eventually as you're going down it? I mean, I've never had any kind of road to Damascus moment or revelation that makes me feel like I necessarily know that I'm hearing something from God. Like, is it, in some ways, faith ultimately comes down to just being a practical thing where you perform it, and eventually you come to understand it in some way. But I haven't had one of those experiences where I've heard God in my ear, or necessarily had something that made me feel like I know that God is speaking to me. Like, to what, as someone who's been in it for a long time, what is that experience like where you know that you're on the right path?
That is a really, really good question. I think what it isn't is that everything is going well for you. There are seasons when things go well, seasons when things are badly. I think a better indication is your path on that road producing in you the fruit of the Spirit? You know, Paul has this list in Galatians: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control.
I actually just shared that this morning on Twitter in Galatians. I'm reading one of Tony Evans's books for Bible study right now, and he's doing a whole chapter on integrity. So,
okay,
but you can go. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think that's part of it. Are those things growing in you? I think another part of it is this expanding your capacity to love? Now, that's different from, does this feel like you're being loved, or does this give me the feeling of love? Does this expand your capacity to love? And love is the generosity. Love is your welfare at my expense. That is what we ultimately see in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Our welfare at his expense. The one of the things that I've noticed from the younger generations is that they are always, I see them often, they're always looking at themselves, and that are things going right? Are things going right? In very narrow bandwidths, in very narrow time, snapshots. Life, hopefully, will be measured in decades. And the observation that you led with, that you look at these young people that are growing up in Christian communities, and they are getting married, and they are settling down with work, and they are getting on with life. Those people are going to have all of the same bumps as everyone else, and they're currently living in a society that says monogamy is a bad idea. You're better off being with someone. In the words of an older song, because none of this is new, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. Okay. And I would say make a commitment. Make a commitment to a spouse. Make a commitment to a church. Make a commitment to a vocation. Now, these come in varying degrees, but it's in those commitments that you will be placed into difficult times when you imagine everything is wrong. One of C.S. Lewis's mentors, George MacDonald, one of his most readable series of books is he has these books about the Princess and Curdie and the Princess and the Goblins. And there's an episode in one of those books where there's a little girl who lives in a house, and she has learned that this magical grandmother lives upstairs. And this magical grandmother is, she's full of power. It's very much a godlike figure. She's full of power, and the little girl knows that there are goblins in the mountains, and they come into the village at night, and there's danger. And so the little girl knows that her grandmother has awesome powers, and so the little girl asks, how can I find my way upstairs when I'm afraid? And the grandmother gives her a ring that has a thread attached to it, a magical thread. And the grandmother says, you can always find me by following this thread. And so one night the little girl is, hears the goblins out and bad things are happening. And so she starts following the thread. And she expects the thread to take her up the stairs to her grandmother. And the thread doesn't. Instead, the thread starts taking her to the mountain where the goblins come out of, and takes her not only into the mountain, but into the goblins' lair. And, first the girl tries to follow the thread backwards and discovers this magic thread doesn't work that way. The only direction she has is to keep following the thread, and she has to trust her grandmother. And then finally the thread takes her to a stone wall and seems to go into the stone wall. And she's just almost panic-stricken that, how can this be happening? How can my grandmother lead me to such a place? And of course, I'm not going to give away what happens, but the grandmother was faithful and the grandmother was true, but she had to follow the thread. And I got this actually from a Tim Keller sermon where he used that illustration. And so what I did for a long time when I'd hear Tim Keller use a particularly good illustration as a pastor, if I was going to use that illustration with integrity, I'd have to dig it up. And so then you dig it up and you read the book, and the whole thing was well worthwhile. But this question of how do I know if I'm on the right track? The right track is not knowledge so much as trust. And so when the thread seems to be taking you to places that seem horribly wrong, you trust, and you don't give up, and you don't let go. And so, fruit of the Spirit are certainly a way. Our capacity to love is another way. A friend of mine that I made in Australia wrote a book. He's a wise Christian man, and he wrote a book entitled How Good is the Golden Rule? And his name is Warren Mills. I don't know if you can get the book in the United States, but his idea was, well, you know what, this golden rule, if you practice it, not if you think about it theoretically, but if you actually practice it, you will grow in Christian maturity, and that's how you find the right path. What you learn is that being loved is easy. Loving is hard. Jesus commands us to love. And so that's the thread you follow.
Though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil.
That's right.
I mean, I was reminded of that. I don't know if you saw Jordan Peterson's interview with the head of Liberty University, but your comment, it reminded me of what he said, that growing into a Christian does not make you a better person. It makes you more aware of yourself and your sins and who you are, more so than it makes you better. So I get the sense that, I mean, I've always benefited from having a rather tragic view of the world, so I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, if I'm joining the church, it's all going to be butterflies and everyone, I'm going to get married and have kids and everything's going to be great. And I'm like, I've never been that romantic about life, so I'm not going into it expecting that everything is going to suddenly get better just because I do the right thing. Although philosophically, that's made me somewhat more deistic, which I need to work through that. But yeah, I haven't quite figured out.
But that's key, because deism. I mean, what's the difference between deism and theism? In deism, a la Charles Taylor, it's the buffered self. That's what leads to nihilism. But theism is actually trusting when you're feeling like a deist.
Well, there you go. I mean, I haven't quite figured out how. I mean, I'm still trying to work through the idea of how we live in a world where bad things can happen, but bad things cannot come from God necessarily. And I might be completely butchering any level of theology by saying that, but I know you're a Calvinist, so I'm sure you have a little more of a...
Read the Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 10 on Providence.
I don't know where I got this spiritual sense that bad things cannot come from God, but my reading
I know where you got it. You got it from American evangelicalism.
I'm sure I did. And it's definitely brought me to a more deistic place where I'm just sitting like, oh, the world is a place of chaos and bad things, and there's a God in the next life, and you got to move towards that because that's what makes life worth living. But that means that God doesn't participate in the world as much as he probably says he does. And I've read enough Dinesh D'Souza theology to have very complicated thoughts about all of this. So,
well, when I was learning Hebrew in seminary, I was reading through the book of Job. Not Job. I was reading through the book of Jonah because it's a nice little Hebrew book to read through when you're learning Hebrew. And I read, and God repented of the evil he was about to do against Nineveh. And I thought, well, that's interesting.
Oh my goodness, I have not heard this.
Well, if you read it it'll come out pretty much. I mean, I'm not one of these people that says, oh, you should only read the King James. But there's something about the King James that the language hasn't been clipped for sensitive American audiences doing their devotions and not wanting to run into something jarring. So reading the King James is a fun exercise sometimes because, well, I don't know, if your theology is an improvement on the Bible, you might have a problem.
Well, there you go. I mean, what do you think is the best translation to read then in terms of just understanding the book for what it is? Because I mean, my family's always been New American Standards. What do you think is the best one then for just getting a sense of what the text is?
I think, look, if you don't have access to the Hebrew or the Greek, look at one of the things I do with my adult Sunday school class is I'm in the New Testament right now, so I have the Greek on one line. I have the Lexham English Bible, which is just a Bible done something like the New American Standard Bible. So fairly literalistic, word for word type translation. And then I'll have the NIV, which is the one that a lot of people in church use and comes from the Christian Reformed Church. And then I'll have the New Living Translation in the fourth. And I'll compare the translations and say, why are these different? Because you always know something is up when the translations are starting to vary, because the editors are trying to figure out how can we make this understandable. So there are actually the New English Translation, the NET is a fine translation. A lot of people like the ESV. There are a lot of really fine translations out there. The thing is, if you're doing Bible study, you're going to want to work them. So just have a bunch of them and read through the different translations, having an idea of the different methods of translation each translation is using. So the New Living Translation is sort of like baby food. It's all been pre-chewed for you. The NIV is sort of like cube steak. It's been mashed up a little bit, but there's still some sinews in there. Something like the New American Standard, well, that's sort of raw, but you have to understand the methodology used. It's word-for-word correspondence, which that might not make much sense either. And so it's the NET isn't bad because it has extensive notes. So you just get, there's no way around doing the work. And again, a good church should help you become a better Bible reader, and many churches don't.
Well, this goes back to my question from the beginning. It's like, oh, how do you know? I mean, it's one of those situations where if you're just starting out, you don't know what you don't know. So I guess the answer is just all of the above. You got to just draw knowledge from every kind of Christianity, every kind of Bible, because it's not, there's no one answer per se, but it's something you have to kind of work through.
Well, I'd say go to my church, but that's me. You don't live in Sacramento. You live in a place with far worse weather. But at the same time, I have a tiny little church, so you have to do the work. You have to follow the thread, and along the way, you have to follow the thread and trust and pray and say, Lord, lead me, and trust that He will. And sometimes you'll feel like the thread is bringing you to the mountain and bringing you up into a stone wall, and you trust still, and you keep doing the work.
All right. I had you booked till 5 o'clock your time. Is there anything you want to close on?
Well, I don't know. This is fun. This is always, I enjoy having these conversations, and no, it's been great getting to know you a little bit, and I just kudos to you, because you're not just going out there to learn. You have a podcast. Good for you. You're doing something. You're sharing your ideas. You're engaging. So just want to take my hat off to you if I was wearing one and say, congratulations. Keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I'm sure the fan is going wild right now. All right. Have a good night. God bless.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.